Jack had been traveling through the snow for what felt like days. The wind howled through the barren land, carrying with it the bitter chill of winter. His breath came out in thick clouds as he trudged through the deep snow, his boots crunching with each step. The snowstorm had come without warning, and now it seemed like it might never end. His mission had started with excitement. He was supposed to survey this remote part of the planet, gather data, and return to base. But things had gone wrong from the start. The storm hit harder than expected, and now Jack was lost. His radio had stopped working, and he had no way of calling for help. He didn't even know which direction to go. All he could do was keep walking and hope for some kind of shelter or sign of civilization. As Jack moved through the snow, he thought about his situation. His food supplies were running low, and the cold seemed to bite deeper with every passing minute. He had managed to build a small fire the night before, but it wouldn't last forever. It was getting harder to see through the snow, and he had no idea how much longer he could keep going. Then, through the swirling storm, he saw something. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. A figure, small and dark, moving slowly through the snow. Jack squinted, his heart pounding. The figure seemed to be getting closer. He stopped in his tracks, unsure if he should continue or hide. It wasn't a common sight in these parts, a person or something that resembled one out here in the freezing cold. As the figure drew near, Jack could see more clearly. It wasn't human. The being was tall and thin, dressed in a strange, shimmering outfit that seemed to reflect the snow. Her skin was a pale blue, almost translucent, and her long hair was white as the snow that surrounded them. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Was she some kind of alien? His mind raced with the possibilities. Could she be from one of the nearby colonies? Or was she stranded like him? Before Jack could react, the alien woman collapsed to the ground. She landed in the snow with a soft thud, her body trembling in the cold. Jack's instincts kicked in. He rushed to her side, kneeling down in the snow. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling quickly. Her eyes were closed, and she seemed unconscious. He didn't know what to do. Was she dangerous? Could she be armed? But then something in her expression made him hesitate. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't a threat. She was simply tired, desperate, and maybe even afraid. Jack checked her for any signs of injury but found none. Her breathing, though shallow, seemed steady. She wasn't going to die just yet, but Jack knew they needed to get out of the snow. He glanced around, searching for shelter, but there was nothing. He was in the middle of nowhere with no shelter for miles. He couldn't just leave her here. Even if she was alien, she was still alive. And Jack knew that no matter where someone came from, that still mattered. He couldn't leave her to freeze to death. Jack scooped her up into his arms, her body light but oddly rigid. She didn't weigh much, but her limbs were stiff, as if they had been exposed to the cold for too long. He started walking, hoping to find some kind of shelter before the storm worsened. After what seemed like hours of walking through the endless snow, Jack finally spotted something ahead. A small half-buried structure, perhaps a research station or abandoned building. Jack moved toward it with all the strength he could muster, his legs feeling like lead. The cold was starting to gnaw at him too, but he couldn't stop now. Not when someone else needed him. He reached the structure and carefully pushed open a door that creaked on its hinges. Inside was dark and cold, but at least it was out of the wind. Jack gently laid the alien woman down on the floor, her body still, limp and cold. He stood over her, unsure of what to do next. He had no medical supplies, no way of warming her up, but he couldn't just leave her like this. He rummaged through the small, abandoned room and found a few scraps of old blankets. It wasn't much, but he wrapped them around her, hoping it would be enough to keep her warm. As he sat down beside her, Jack noticed something odd. Despite the fact that she was unconscious, she was muttering softly. The words were strange, unlike anything Jack had ever heard before. But one phrase stood out to him. "One meal for my child." It was clear now that she wasn't just stranded. She had someone she cared for, someone who needed help. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? And what was this about a child? But for now, all he could do was wait. He couldn't leave her. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he couldn't walk away from someone in need, even if she wasn't human. Jack sat beside the alien woman, his mind racing as he tried to understand the situation. The storm outside continued to howl, but the small building gave them shelter from the worst of it. He had no idea how long she had been out in the snow, but he could feel her body trembling beneath the thin blankets he had found. Her skin, pale and blue-tinged, looked even more fragile in the dim light of the abandoned structure. He watched her closely, waiting for any sign of movement. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, but it wasn't the steady rhythm Jack was used to. There was something wrong. She was struggling, her breath shallow, as though each one was a fight. Jack had never been trained for situations like this. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't know what to do. He had no medical supplies, no way to really help her except for the warmth of the blankets. Still, he couldn't just do nothing. His thoughts kept returning to the strange words she had whispered. "One meal for my child." The way she had said it, almost as if it were a plea, had left Jack unsettled. Who was this child? Was she the only one left of her kind? Why was she out here alone? He shook his head, trying to focus on the present moment. The first priority was getting her warm and awake. Jack gently placed his hand on her forehead, feeling the coldness of her skin. He frowned, unsure of what to do next. In the silence, the sound of her slow breathing was all he could hear. The storm outside seemed to be growing stronger, and Jack wondered if anyone would come looking for him. The idea of rescue felt distant, almost impossible. His mission, his team, they all felt so far away now. In the corner of the small shelter, Jack's backpack sat on the floor. He had a few supplies left, mostly freeze-dried food and a couple of energy bars. But it wasn't much. His eyes drifted back to the alien woman. If she was truly stranded, if she had come from a distant planet, then what would she need? What kind of food did her body require? He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. There was no way he could make contact with anyone else in the storm. No way he could get help for both of them. Jack shifted his position, sitting, cross-legged on the floor, watching the woman closely. Her breathing had slowed, but she still wasn't conscious. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here, something bigger than just a random encounter. She wasn't just a survivor of the cold, she was a mother, and somehow that felt even more important. What had she meant by her words? One meal for my child. It was clear now that her child wasn't here with her, and the thought made Jack uneasy. He had no way of knowing what happened to the child, but the desperation in her voice had been real. After a long while, Jack couldn't sit still any longer. He had to do something. The cold from outside still crept in through the gaps in the walls, and the fire he had managed to start earlier had burned low. Jack knew that he needed to keep moving to stay warm, but he also couldn't leave her side. It was a strange feeling, but he couldn't explain it. There was a part of him that just couldn't walk away from someone in need, no matter who or what they were. He stood up and moved toward the corner where he had placed his pack. The thought of food wasn't the first thing on his mind, but as he opened the pack, he realized how little he had left. His stomach growled in hunger, but there wasn't much to share. He had a few small packs of dried meat, some energy bars, and a couple of bottles of water. But the supplies would not last long. Even though he couldn't offer much, Jack felt compelled to give her something, to make sure she had enough to recover. He unwrapped one of the energy bars and looked at it for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He carefully broke the bar in half and held it out, hoping the alien woman might wake up enough to eat. As he sat back down beside her, he thought about the way she had looked at him earlier. So fragile, so helpless. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't a danger to him. She was just a mother, and Jack could relate to that more than anything. Her child. Jack's heart clenched at the thought of the missing child. What was this child like? How had they survived? Where were they? These questions gnawed at him, but there was no answer, For now, all he could do was wait. Wait for her to wake. Wait for some sign of her recovery and hope that somehow he could help. A few minutes passed and Jack was just about to take a bite of his own energy bar when the alien woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and then she blinked, looking up at him, with confusion and exhaustion in her eyes. For a moment, Jack wasn't sure if she remembered him or even where she was. But then her gaze shifted down to the food he was holding out. Her voice was weak as she whispered, "One meal for my child?" Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. He nodded, offering the small piece of food to her. "I don't have much," he said softly, "but it's all I can give." The alien woman reached out with trembling hands, taking the food from him. She didn't eat immediately, instead looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Jack watched her closely, trying to make sense of everything, but for now he just hoped she would survive. He didn't know what the future would hold for them, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave her alone in the snow. Not now. Not when she needed help the most. The silence in the small shelter was heavy as Jack watched the alien woman. She had taken the small piece of food he offered, but she didn't seem to be eating it right away. Her pale blue eyes were wide, as if trying to understand the world around her. Jack wasn't sure if she was confused by her surroundings, by the food, or by him, but he could see the exhaustion in her face, the weariness that came from days of survival in the cold. Her hands trembled as she held the food, and Jack could tell she wasn't used to such gestures of kindness. She had taken the food without saying much, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even gratitude. Jack felt a strange mix of relief and concern. He had done something, but was it enough? Would it be enough to help her recover? Jack shifted his position and sat a little closer, but he kept his distance, careful not to make her feel uncomfortable. "How long were you out there?" he asked softly, hoping for some answer, though he wasn't sure if she understood him. Her language was strange, filled with sounds Jack couldn't even begin to replicate. She didn't respond right away, but her gaze shifted downward and Jack noticed she seemed to be struggling with something. It was almost as if she was trying to remember something or piece together her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My child," she said, her words slow and heavy, as if saying them took all her energy. Jack's heart sank. Her words echoed in his mind. "One meal for my child." He had known she had a child, but the reality of it was starting to hit him. What had happened to her child? Why was she alone, stranded on this cold, desolate planet? She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sadness Jack couldn't ignore. I have no food," she said, her voice weak. "My child needs food." Her words were simple but powerful, a clear plea for help. Jack couldn't imagine the pain she must have felt, knowing her child was out there, cold, hungry, and alone. Jack didn't know how to respond. He was just one person stuck in the same desperate situation. He had barely enough food for himself, let alone for someone else. But he couldn't leave her hanging, couldn't ignore the fact that she was a mother who cared for her child as much as any human mother would. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a bond, a connection that went beyond species, beyond everything he had known. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll help you," he said, though the words felt hollow. What could he do? His supplies were running low, and he had no way of reaching anyone for help, but he couldn't turn his back on her now. Not after everything she had already been through. The alien woman seemed to relax a little when he spoke, though she was still weak. Jack didn't know if she understood fully, but she gave him a faint, tired smile. It was a small gesture, but it made Jack feel like he was doing something right. He couldn't change her situation, but he could stand by her, offer what little help he had left. Jack stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for too long, and walked over to his backpack. He opened it, searching for whatever food he had left. He had a couple of freeze-dried meals, some protein bars, and a small supply of water. It wasn't much, but it had to be enough. He wasn't sure what kind of food the alien woman needed, but it was all he could offer. He returned to her side and held out a small packet of food. It was one of his last meals, but Jack didn't hesitate. He knew she needed it more than he did. Her eyes locked onto the packet, and for the first time since Jack had found her, she seemed to come alive. She reached out slowly, taking the food from his hand with a kind of reverence as though she had never received something like this before. Jack watched her carefully as she opened the packet and began to eat. She didn't rush, taking small, careful bites as though savoring each one. Jack could see the relief in her eyes even as she ate. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her some strength. As she ate, Jack found himself wondering about her life. Where had she come from? How had she ended up on this cold, lonely planet? The more he thought about it, the more questions filled his mind. There was so much he didn't understand. "Where is your child?" Jack asked quietly, not expecting a direct answer but hoping for some kind of response. The alien woman paused for a moment, her gaze drifting to the ground. She seemed to be gathering her thoughts before she spoke again. "Lost," she said softly. "In the cold. I left to find food. To survive. For her." Jack's heart ached. She had left her child behind in search of food. What kind of world had she come from where a mother had to make such a choice? Jack had seen the bond between mother and child before, but this was something else entirely. The alien woman's sacrifice was something that spoke to him on a level he couldn't fully explain. "I'll help you find your child," Jack said, his voice firm. "We'll get through this together." The alien woman looked at him, her eyes filled with something Jack couldn't quite read. Was it hope? Relief? Maybe both. She nodded slowly, the smallest hint of a smile returning to her face. For the first time since he had found her, Jack felt like he wasn't just lost in the snow. He was part of something bigger, something that connected him to this alien woman in a way he never expected. They were two strangers, but in that moment they weren't so different. They were survivors, and together they would face whatever came next. The days that followed were difficult. The storm outside raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Jack and the alien woman, whose name he still hadn't learned, stayed inside the small shelter, using what little they had to survive. Jack did his best to keep the fire going, but the wood was scarce. He had to be careful, rationing the fuel and hoping the fire would last long enough to keep them both warm. Each day the alien woman grew stronger, though she remained weak. She had eaten what little Jack could give her, and she had rested, her body slowly recovering from the cold. But despite the warmth of the shelter and the food, there was still a sadness in her eyes. Her mind seemed distant, as though she was thinking of her lost child, her worry never far from the surface. Jack tried to keep her occupied, talking to her when she could understand. He told her about Earth, about his life, though he knew she couldn't fully grasp everything he said. She listened quietly, nodding in response to the few words she understood. Jack found comfort in her company, though the situation was still dire. They were both stranded in this frozen place, and Jack had no idea how long it would be before rescue arrived, or if it would arrive at all. One night, as the wind howled outside, Jack was sitting near the fire, staring into the flames. The alien woman was resting nearby, wrapped in the blankets Jack had found. Her breathing was steady now, though she was still weak. Jack glanced at her, wondering what would happen if they couldn't find her child. Could he leave her here to search? Was it even possible to find someone in a storm this fierce? The thoughts plagued him, but there was no time to dwell on them. The survival instinct kicked in. He couldn't sit still. He needed to do something. "I'm going to try to find help," Jack said softly, though he wasn't sure if she could understand him fully. She hadn't said much since that day, but Jack believed she could hear him. The alien woman's eyes opened at the sound of his voice. She blinked, the confusion still there, but she looked at him with those wide, sad eyes. "You go?" she asked, her voice rough, barely a whisper. Jack nodded. "I'll find help. I'll find your child." He wasn't sure how he could do it, but he couldn't just sit here waiting. She needed him to act. They both needed something more than just survival. They needed hope. The alien woman reached out weakly, her hand trembling as it touched his arm. "Cold," she said, a soft plea in her voice. Jack sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. He knew that going outside was dangerous, but he also knew that staying here without doing anything would make them both more vulnerable. "I'll be back. I won't go far," he promised. He gathered what little he had left, a small pack of food, a few water bottles, and his jacket. He didn't know how long he would be out there, but he couldn't waste any more time. With one last look at the alien woman, Jack stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a slap in the face as he stepped outside. The wind was fierce, the snow so thick it was almost impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead of him. The cold seemed to cut right through his jacket, and he could feel the bite of it in his bones. But he pushed forward, his steps slow and deliberate as he made his way into the blizzard. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he had to try. He had to find something, a way to help her, a sign of life, anything. The alien woman had mentioned her child was out there somewhere, but Jack couldn't imagine how he could find a lost child in this kind of storm. There was no way to track them, no way to know if they were still alive. But Jack couldn't just sit there, doing nothing. He had to believe that he could find them. Hours passed as he walked through the snow. The storm made it almost impossible to keep moving, but Jack pressed on. His legs grew heavy with each step, and his breath became shallow from the cold, but he didn't stop. Every so often he would call out, though he knew it was pointless. The wind swallowed up any sound, and the blizzard only seemed to get worse. He stumbled once, his foot catching on something hidden under the snow, but he caught himself before he fell. He wasn't sure how much further he could go, but he refused to turn back without trying. And then, just when he was beginning to feel like he couldn't go any further, he saw something. In the distance, barely visible through the snow, he saw a faint shape, something moving. His heart skipped a beat. Was it a person? Could it be her child? Jack's pace quickened, his legs aching with each step, but he pushed through the pain. As he got closer, the figure became clearer. It was small, huddled against the wind, but it was definitely alive. Jack's hope surged, but then fear followed. What if it wasn't the child? What if it was just another illusion in the storm? But, as he got closer, he could see it more clearly. It was a small figure, no taller than a child, wrapped in rags. They were shaking, their arms wrapped tightly around their body to shield themselves from the cold. "Hey," Jack called out, his voice hoarse from the wind. The figure stopped and turned toward him, and Jack could see the face. It wasn't much of a face, just a pale, shivering form with wide eyes filled with fear. But Jack knew. It was the alien woman's child. Jack's heart raced as he moved closer to the small figure huddled in the snow. The child was barely more than a blur, wrapped in ragged clothes that offered little protection from the biting cold. The child's eyes, wide and frightened, locked onto Jack's, and for a moment everything stopped. Jack couldn't believe it. There, standing in front of him, was the child the alien woman had been speaking about, her lost child. Despite the storm's rage, despite the freezing cold, Jack knew in that moment that he couldn't leave them. He couldn't walk away from someone who needed him, not after everything he had seen. The child, seeing Jack move forward, staggered back, unsure of what to make of him. They were weak, trembling, their bodies stiff with cold, and Jack knew they couldn't stay out here much longer. The blizzard was worsening, and the temperature was dropping fast. He had no time to waste. "It's okay," Jack said, his voice barely audible over the wind. He reached his hand out slowly, not wanting to scare the child more. "I'm here to help. You're safe now." The child didn't respond. They just stared at him, their small bodies shaking uncontrollably. Jack could see the fear in their eyes. How long had they been out here? How long had they been alone? Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He didn't know what to do next. He had no supplies left to offer, no food to give, but he couldn't just leave the child to freeze. There had to be something he could do. He crouched down to the child's level, trying to make himself seem less threatening, even though the storm and his cold breath made everything feel distant and harsh. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack said softly. The words felt weak in the storm, but he had to try. "I'm here to help, come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe." The child didn't move, still staring at Jack with those wide, fearful eyes. Jack reached out, carefully brushing some of the snow off the child's shoulders. They flinched slightly at the touch, but didn't pull away. Jack's heart clenched as he noticed how frail the child looked. Their skin was pale and they seemed too small for their age. They had clearly been through something terrible. "I know you're scared," Jack said, his voice steady even as his hands shook from the cold. "But I'm not going to leave you. Your mom's waiting. We can get out of here together." At the mention of their mother, the child's expression softened slightly. Jack could see it in their eyes. They were remembering the alien woman. The child wasn't completely gone from the world around them. There was hope, and Jack was determined to help them find their way back to safety. Finally, the child took a hesitant step forward, their small feet sinking into the snow. Jack reached out his hand again, this time with more certainty. "That's it," he said, offering a small smile. "We're going to make it." The child, still trembling, placed their small, cold hand in Jack's, and with that, Jack gently helped them stand. The weight of their body was light, almost fragile, and Jack felt a deep ache for how much this child had endured alone. He steadied the child as best as he could, helping them stay upright in the harsh winds. They began walking slowly, Jack guiding the child through the snow. It was slow progress, but Jack was determined. The cold wind stung his face, but he ignored it, focusing on the child beside him. They couldn't stop. Not now. Not after coming this far. As they moved, Jack's mind raced with questions. How had the child ended up out here alone? Had the alien woman been separated from them during the crash, or had she been searching for the child just like Jack? He thought of the alien woman back in the shelter waiting, probably hoping that Jack had found her child. The bond between them seemed so clear now, even though Jack didn't fully understand it. He was determined to bring them together again, to make sure they both survived. The journey felt endless, the snowstorm blurring everything around them. Jack could hardly see a few feet ahead, but he kept going, every step taking him closer to the shelter where the alien woman waited. The child's grip on his hand tightened, and Jack offered them as much comfort as he could. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking through the storm, the outline of the shelter appeared in the distance. It was barely visible through the thick snow, but Jack could make it out. A wave of relief washed over him, but he didn't let himself stop yet. He kept moving, his body sore and exhausted, pushing forward until they reached the small structure. When they finally made it, inside, Jack didn't waste a second. He quickly helped the child inside and closed the door behind them, shielding them from the worst of the storm. The shelter was still cold, but it was a welcome refuge compared to the fierce winds outside. The alien woman was still there, wrapped in the blankets Jack had given her. She looked up as Jack entered with her child. Her eyes widened with disbelief, and Jack could see the tears welling up in her eyes as she saw her child safe in his arms. The child, still shivering, ran to their mother, collapsing into her arms. The alien woman pulled them close, holding them tightly, her face filled with relief and love. Jack stood back, watching the reunion unfold before him. There was a deep, unspoken bond between the two of them, and Jack couldn't help but feel grateful to have been a part of this moment. The alien woman looked at Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression said it all. Without a word, she reached out to him, giving him a small nod of thanks. Jack smiled back, feeling a deep warmth in his chest despite the cold around them. They had made it. They were all safe. Jack sat near the small fire watching the two of them, mother and child, reunited. The alien woman held her child tightly, her arms wrapped around them in a protective embrace. The child, still shivering but now safe, rested against their mother. The warmth of the shelter was a blessing compared to the freezing cold outside, but the relief in the room was felt in more ways than just physical comfort. Jack stayed quiet, giving them space to share their moment. He knew this had to be one of the most important moments of their lives. The bond between mother and child was something Jack could understand better now, having witnessed it firsthand. The storm outside might have been relentless, But inside, the shelter, there was a sense of peace. The alien woman looked at Jack after a while, her eyes filled with thanks. She didn't have the words, but her expression said everything. Jack had no idea how to respond, so he simply nodded, offering a small smile. He was relieved, even though he hadn't fully understood their language. The way they looked at him told him everything he needed to know. The child's trembling had slowed and their breathing had become steadier. Jack was grateful that he had made it back in time. The storm still raged outside, but inside the shelter things were beginning to calm down. As the fire crackled softly, Jack got up to check his supplies. There wasn't much left, but there was enough to keep them going for a while longer. He took out one of his last remaining energy bars and broke it in half, offering a piece to the alien woman. She took it without hesitation, and her child reached for it as well. Jack watched as they shared the small meal, silently grateful that he could give them something even if it wasn't much. The alien woman glanced at Jack, her eyes full of a quiet curiosity. She was studying him in a way that made Jack feel both uncomfortable and strangely honored. He wasn't sure how to interpret it, but he could sense a growing connection. She was a mother first and foremost, and that made her different from the other people Jack had met. She wasn't just an alien. She was someone who cared deeply for her child. Jack couldn't help but think about what had brought them here. How they had both ended up in this situation. He didn't know if they would ever return to their homeworld, or if Jack would make it out of this frozen wasteland. But for now, they were together. He had done what he could to help. And now, it was up to them to figure out the rest. "I don't know how long the storm will last," Jack said quietly, his voice barely rising above the crackling fire. The alien woman looked at him, her eyes understanding. She nodded but didn't speak. She wasn't ready to talk yet, and Jack respected that. She had her own story, her own pain to work through. He knew there was so much more he didn't understand, but he also knew that words weren't always necessary. Actions spoke louder, and he had done what he could for her and her child. Jack stood up, moving to the corner of the shelter where he had placed his pack. He opened it carefully and found a few more scraps of food. It wasn't much, but he could stretch it for a little longer. He looked over at the alien woman and her child, both wrapped in the blankets, trying to get comfortable. They were so small, so fragile, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just survival. The alien woman had been alone, desperate, willing to give everything for her child, and Jack, he had been the same. He had risked everything leaving the shelter to find the child in the snowstorm. Neither of them had given up, not even when the odds were against them. They had found each other in the middle of a world that seemed to have forgotten them. As Jack sat back down, he noticed the alien woman's gaze follow him. She didn't speak, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him feel like she was still trying to understand him, trying to understand the connection between them. The warmth of the fire seemed to fill the shelter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to relax. His muscles, which had been tense for days, began to loosen. He let out a deep breath, realizing just how exhausted he was. He hadn't really slept in what felt like days, and the weight of everything was starting to settle in. The relief of having the child safe, the alien woman safe, was something Jack couldn't quite put into words. It was a quiet satisfaction, a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The storm outside was still fierce, but Jack knew it would eventually pass. They would survive. They had to. He couldn't leave them now, not after everything. They had formed an unspoken bond, a connection that went beyond words, beyond species. Jack had helped them find each other again, and in turn they had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, a purpose, a reason to keep going. In the quiet of the shelter, Jack let his eyes drift closed for a moment, just resting. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't be alone in this cold, desolate place anymore. The next morning, the storm had eased. The snow still fell gently outside, but the wind had calmed down, and the dark clouds that had blanketed the sky for so long were starting to break apart. Jack awoke to the soft crackle of the fire, the warmth of it filling the shelter. His body was sore, his muscles stiff from days of walking, but there was a new sense of hope in the air. The alien woman and her child were safe, at least for now. Jack sat up slowly, stretching his aching limbs. The alien woman was still asleep, her child curled up beside her. They looked peaceful, at least in that moment, and Jack was thankful for that. The child, now less pale and shivering, was wrapped in the blankets Jack had found, their small face relaxed in sleep. The alien woman lay with her head resting against the wall, a faint smile on her lips as she slept, exhausted from everything that had happened. Jack stood up quietly, trying not to disturb them. He stepped outside the shelter, needing some fresh air and a moment to himself. The cold air hit him immediately, but it was a different cold now, crisp and clean, no longer the biting chill of the blizzard. The sky was a dull gray, but the world outside felt less dangerous than it had just a day before. The worst of the storm had passed, and Jack knew that meant they had a chance to move forward. He looked around, scanning the horizon. There was nothing for miles, just endless snow-covered ground. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape, but at least it wasn't actively trying to kill them anymore. Jack's eyes returned to the shelter behind him, where the alien woman and her child were resting. He couldn't leave them alone again, not until they were back on their feet. He took a deep breath and turned back toward the shelter. As he re-entered, he found the alien woman awake, her eyes meeting his as he stepped inside. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him with quiet understanding. There was no need for words, Jack realized. They had been through so much together already, and in that silence, they understood each other more than anything words could convey. "Good morning," Jack said, his voice a little rough from the cold. But he smiled anyway. The alien woman returned the smile, her expression softening as she looked at him. She didn't speak, but Jack noticed the way her eyes flickered to the fire, then back to him, as if silently asking if they could leave. The shelter. It wasn't time yet. They were still too weak. Jack knew they needed more rest, more food before they could even think about moving. "We'll wait a bit longer," Jack said softly, his voice calm. "It's too early to go anywhere just yet." The alien woman nodded and turned her attention to her child. Her gaze lingered there for a moment, and Jack could see the love she had for them. She gently adjusted the blankets around the child, brushing a strand of hair away from their face. Jack realized he was witnessing something deeply personal, a moment of tenderness and care that he could never truly understand in the way she did. Jack stepped back, giving them space. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about healing, both physically and emotionally. They had all been through so much, and now they needed time to recover, to come to terms with what had happened. He checked his supplies again, finding that there was still a little food left, just enough to last them for one more day. It wasn't ideal, but they would make it work. Jack knew they couldn't stay in the shelter forever. The storm had passed, and while the weather was still cold, it was manageable. But he wasn't about to rush them out into the unknown until they were ready. As the day wore on, Jack did what he could to help. He kept the fire going, prepared what little food they had left, and made sure the alien woman and her child stayed warm. The shelter was small, but it was enough to keep them safe for now. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than nothing. The alien woman rested most of the day, her child still weak but slowly recovering. Jack found himself feeling protective of them both, even though he knew he didn't have much to offer. The truth was, he didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how they would get out of this frozen wasteland or what kind of help they would find, but he couldn't leave them behind. He couldn't let them face this alone. That night, as Jack sat by the fire, watching the alien woman and her child, a thought crossed his mind. He wasn't alone here. He had made a connection with them even if he didn't fully understand it. He had helped them when they needed it most, and now they were together, safe for the moment. It was strange. A few days ago, Jack had been lost, in the snow, unsure of how he would survive. Now he was still here, still fighting, and in some strange way he felt a sense of belonging. The alien woman and her child weren't just survivors. They were people he cared about. They were family in a way, even if it was a family born from hardship and necessity. Jack leaned back against the wall, his eyes closing for just a moment. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't just struggling to survive. He was part of something, and that was enough for now. The next morning, Jack woke up to a quiet stillness in the shelter. The storm had completely passed, leaving behind a clear, cold sky. The snow outside still covered everything, but the world no longer felt like an endless blur of white. There was hope now, and Jack knew it was time to move. He looked over at the alien woman and her child. They were both still sleeping, resting more peacefully than they had in days. The child's small body was curled up against their mother, who kept them close. It was a simple, peaceful scene, but Jack knew they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to leave. The shelter had been a safe haven for a while, but now it was just a place holding them back. He didn't want to wake them, but Jack knew they had to get moving soon. The sooner they left, the sooner they could find help. He stood up quietly, careful not to disturb them, and moved to the door. He cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The cold air rushed in, sharp and biting, but the wind was calmer now, and the sky above them was clear. The world outside seemed wide open, waiting for them to take the first step. Jack grabbed his jacket, wrapping it tightly around himself. He wasn't sure how much further they had to go, but he couldn't stay in the shelter any longer. They needed to find more supplies, and the longer they waited, the more dangerous it could become. As Jack started to prepare, the alien woman woke. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw him standing near the door. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from the long hours of rest. She looked at Jack, and without a word he could see the understanding in her eyes. She knew it was time. She didn't need to ask where they were going or why. She knew that they couldn't stay here. Jack smiled softly at her, trying to reassure her without speaking. But she didn't seem scared. She had been through too much to be afraid of what came next. She was ready to face whatever was out there, just like Jack. She stood up, gently waking her child. The child stirred, their eyes opening slowly, still tired but more alert than before. The alien woman whispered softly to them, and the child nodded, sitting up beside her. There was still a tenderness in the way the alien mother cared for her child, even though they had been through so much. It was a bond that Jack couldn't help but admire. "We'll find help," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't know if that was true. He didn't know where they could go, but he had to believe that they could make it. He had to believe that they would find a way out of this frozen place. The alien woman nodded, understanding his words even if she couldn't fully speak them. She reached for her child, lifting them into her arms as they began to move toward the door. Jack stepped aside to let them pass, the air outside as cold as ever. But it was better than staying in the shelter. Together, they stepped out into the snow, the crunch of their footsteps the only sound. The alien woman moved slowly, her child nestled in her arms while Jack followed closely behind. The path ahead was unclear, but Jack was determined. They had survived this far, and now they had to keep moving forward. The world outside was vast and silent, the snow stretching out in all directions. Jack glanced at the alien woman, who was looking around carefully, as if searching for something familiar. She didn't seem lost, just focused on finding a way forward. Jack knew that if anyone could survive this, it was her. She had been through so much already, and now she had to do what she had always done: survive for her child. The journey was slow, but they kept moving, each step a little easier than the last. The weather was still cold, but it wasn't as harsh as it had been. They made their way through the snow, the alien woman holding her child close, Jack keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. After a few hours, they reached a small ridge, the landscape stretching out in front of them. Jack could see no signs of life, but he kept walking, hoping for a sign. He had no plan, no map, but he had hope. They had made it this far, and he wasn't about to give up now. Then in the distance, Jack spotted something, a faint outline of a structure, barely visible through the snow. His heart skipped a beat. It was something, at least. A place, too, rest, maybe even a way to reach help. "Look," Jack said, pointing toward the shape in the distance. The alien woman looked toward it, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, but Jack could see the flicker of hope in her eyes. She had always been strong, always focused on her child. But now, she was looking ahead, ready to face whatever came next. They continued toward the structure, Jack's steps growing more confident with each one. The cold was still there, the snow still fell, but for the first time Jack felt like they were going to be okay. They weren't alone anymore, not with each other. Together, they would keep going, and maybe, just maybe, they would find a way home. As they approached the structure, Jack felt a quiet sense of pride. They had made it through the worst of it. There were still many unknowns ahead, but they had made it this far. And that, for now, was enough.